Welcome back. This is Lecture 3. In this lecture, we take on the subject of organizations under international law. Now, previously, we had discussed international law as being involving the rules regulating interactions between the states. But then we said that things had changed in large part since the end of World War II to encompass rules regulating organizations. So in this lecture, what we're going to look at briefly is the role of international organizations. What is their legal status and what role do they play in international law? Now, there are many similarities between states and international organizations, but there's a couple of key differences, and that's what we'll be focusing on that. As we go through this lecture, remember this above all, that an organization is dependent on the states that created it. So although we'll discuss organizations, you should not consider them on the same level as states, because ultimately the organization's control is going to be ceded to those states that created the organization. So in this lecture, we look at the role of organizations in state law. And we start with what is an international organization? What is an international organization? Well, simply put, an international organization is an institution established by agreement of the members who created it. The common feature of international organizations, the thing that they share, is that they involve working on a cooperative basis. The members will benefit from the organization. They are working toward common objectives. And that's what you should remember about an international organization. Now, when we talk about international organizations, typically we're going to talk about them as being made up of states, member states. However, that's not always true. An international organization could consist of states, individuals, or even other international organizations. Organizations together can create a new international organization. We're going to focus for this first part on public international organizations. Now, to qualify as a public international organization, which sometimes we abbreviate PIO, an entity must be created, number one, by an international agreement among states. In order to be a public international organization, it must be created by an agreement among states. It must be created as a new legal entity, a separate entity that functions independently of state control. So, although a group of states could create an international organization, to qualify as a public international organization, that organization must be able to operate without the need for state control and without being subjected to state control. And finally, the third element is this organization must be created pursuant to international law. That international law is going to provide the legal infrastructure for this organization. Now, sometimes these public international organizations are created by a treaty. We said that we need an agreement. That agreement could be a treaty, and we'll talk more about treaties in an upcoming lecture. Or it could be created by agreements of government representatives, that something like OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, that's an international organization, a public international organization, but it's the product of an agreement that was reached at a meeting of states' representatives. Now, we said a public international organization has a legal personality. In the law, when we talk about a personality, we talk about an entity that has a unique identity, that its identity is not subject to the identity of another institution. So a corporation is a separate legal personality from those shareholders that own the corporation. Even if there's just one shareholder, the shareholder is a separate legal personality from the corporation that is created. Famously, corporations cannot represent themselves in a court of law. Even if you're 100% shareholder of a corporation, you don't get to go represent that corporation because that corporation is a distinct legal personality. Now, since World War II, the number of public international organizations has increased dramatically. In the 20th century, this idea of the state as being the ultimate controller of sovereignty has become obsolete, and we've started to see that there is now a very important role being played in the world by organizations. Now, initially we saw that in the latter half of the 20th century with the United Nations, which we'll cover next, and more recently we've seen an international organization that's had a tremendous impact, and it's not something that you ordinarily think about when you think about international organizations, and that's NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So in the next lecture, part of this lecture, we're going to cover those two entities, those two public international organizations.